The mist hung low over the Teutoburg forest in the late spring of 782 AD, concealing movements that would soon erupt into one of the most devastating military defeats in Saxon history. Somewhere in the dense woodlands that separated Frankish territory from Saxon lands, a massive raiding force of approximately 25,000 Saxon warriors had assembled, their eyes fixed on the rich Frankish settlements to the west. They could not have known that their invasion would end in catastrophic failure, crushed by a force barely one-fifth their size under the command of a king who would become known as Charlemagne the Great. This encounter, though often overshadowed by more famous battles in Charlemagne's lengthy Saxon campaigns, represents a masterclass in medieval military leadership, strategic positioning, and the effective use of combined arms tactics. The destruction of such a numerically superior force reveals much about the evolution of warfare in early medieval Europe and the transformation of the Frankish military machine under Charlemagne's rule. The strategic context: a war of 3 decades. To understand how such a lopsided victory occurred, we must first examine the broader conflict between the Franks and Saxons. Charlemagne's Saxon Wars, which lasted from 772 to 804 AD, represented one of the longest and most brutal campaigns of the medieval period. The Saxons occupied the territories of modern-day northern Germany, a region of dense forests, marshlands, and scattered settlements that made conventional warfare extraordinarily difficult. The Saxons were not a unified nation, but rather a confederation of tribes, including the Westphalians, Eastphalians, Angrians, and Nordalbingians. Each maintained its own leadership structure, though they could unite against common threats. Unlike the Christianized Franks, the Saxons clung fiercely to their pagan traditions, worshipping gods like Woden and gathering at sacred groves for religious ceremonies. This religious divide transformed what might have been merely a territorial conflict into something approaching a holy war. Charlemagne ascended to sole rulership of the Frankish kingdom in 771 AD, after the death of his brother Carloman. Almost immediately, he set his sights on Saxon territory. His motivations were manifold. The Saxons regularly raided Frankish border settlements, disrupting trade and agriculture. Their territory blocked Frankish expansion to the northeast, and Charlemagne viewed their conversion to Christianity as both a religious duty and a means of securing permanent control over the region. The initial Frankish campaigns had mixed results. Charlemagne would invade, the Saxons would submit and offer hostages, and the Frankish army would withdraw for the winter. Then, with predictable regularity, the Saxons would revolt, massacre any Frankish garrisons or missionaries left behind, and resume their raids. This cycle repeated itself with frustrating consistency through the 770s. By 782, Charlemagne had been fighting the Saxons for a decade. He had destroyed the Irminsul, a sacred Saxon pillar, in 772. He had received submissions from various Saxon leaders. He had even appointed Frankish administrators to govern Saxon territories. Yet the region remained volatile, with rebellions flaring up repeatedly. The Saxon leader Widukind had emerged as a particularly effective resistance commander, repeatedly escaping Frankish attempts to capture him and inspiring continued resistance. The Saxon Raid. Ambition and opportunity. In the spring of 782, the Saxons saw an opportunity. Charlemagne was campaigning against the Sorbs, a Slavic people to the east, drawing away significant Frankish military resources. The Frankish border defenses were consequently weakened, and the Saxons, under Widukind's inspiration if not direct command, decided to launch a massive raid into Frankish territory. The assembly of 25,000 warriors represented an enormous mobilization for the Saxons. This was not a typical raiding party of a few hundred warriors seeking plunder. This was an army capable of conquering territory, destroying fortifications and potentially threatening major Frankish population centers. The force likely included warriors from multiple Saxon tribes, suggesting a coordinated effort to take advantage of Charlemagne's absence. Saxon warfare traditionally emphasized mobility and surprise. Their warriors were primarily infantry, armed with spears, short swords called scramasaxes, and wooden shields. Some wealthier warriors might possess chainmail or helmets, but most wore leather armor or thick woolen clothing. They excelled at fighting in their native forests and marshes, using ambush tactics and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to offset any disadvantages in equipment or training. The Saxon raiders crossed into Frankish territory with confidence born of numbers. 25,000 warriors could overwhelm most defenses, pillage extensively, and retreat before Charlemagne could return from his eastern campaign. They moved through the borderlands, targeting villages, monasteries, and isolated estates. The psychological impact was as important as the material damage. Each successful raid demonstrated that Frankish control over Saxon territory remained tenuous at best. Charlemagne's response: speed and decision. When word reached Charlemagne of the massive Saxon incursion, he faced a critical decision. He was deep in Sorb territory with the main Frankish army. Withdrawing completely would require weeks and would allow the Saxons to ravage Frankish lands unopposed. Yet he could not ignore such a substantial threat. Charlemagne's solution demonstrated the strategic thinking that would make him one of history's great military commanders. Rather than withdraw his entire force, he would divide his army. He dispatched a flying column of approximately 5,000 warriors under trusted commanders, with orders to intercept and engage the Saxon raiders immediately, while he consolidated his position against the Sorbs before following with the main army. The selection of this force revealed Charlemagne's tactical acumen. The 5,000 warriors were not randomly chosen. They represented the cream of Frankish military power, heavily armored cavalry, professional warriors who served in Charlemagne's personal retinue, and experienced infantry who had campaigned for years in Saxon territory. This was a combined arms force designed for maximum impact. The core of the Frankish force consisted of mounted warriors. Frankish cavalry in this period had undergone significant development. Unlike earlier Germanic warriors who fought primarily on foot, Charlemagne's cavalry had adopted stirrups, probably introduced from the east in the preceding century. This seemingly simple innovation revolutionized mounted warfare. Stirrups allowed riders to brace themselves in the saddle, enabling them to deliver much more powerful lance strikes and sword blows without being unhorsed by the impact. These cavalrymen wore substantial armor. The wealthiest possessed full chain mail hauberks extending from neck to knee. Others wore scale armor or leather reinforced with metal plates. Iron helmets, many with nose guards or face masks, protected their heads. They carried long lances for the initial charge, swords for close combat, and shields. Their horses, while not as large as later medieval destriers, were bred for strength and stamina rather than speed. Supporting the cavalry were infantry units armed with spears, axes, and shields. Some served as crossbowmen or archers, though missile weapons played a relatively minor role in Frankish tactics of this era. The infantry's primary purpose was to hold ground captured by cavalry charges, to fight in terrain unsuitable for mounted action, and to provide a solid anchor around which the cavalry could maneuver. The command structure of this force reflected Frankish military organization. Charlemagne appointed counts and other nobles as commanders, each leading their own contingents of warriors. These men had grown up training for war, had inherited martial traditions from their fathers, and had been tested in years of campaigning. They understood combined arms tactics and could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The march. Racing to intercept. The Frankish flying column faced a daunting challenge. They needed to intercept a Saxon force 5 times their size, ideally catching them in circumstances that negated the Saxon numerical advantage. This required both speed and intelligence gathering. Frankish armies of this period could move with surprising rapidity when necessary. The cavalry, of course, could cover significant distances quickly. Even the infantry, though moving on foot, maintained a pace of 20 to 30 miles per day on Roman roads, which still crisscrossed much of Frankish territory, despite centuries of neglect. The Franks had inherited and maintained the Roman Empire's road network, understanding its military value. As they marched, Frankish scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks, gathering intelligence on Saxon movements. These scouts were expert trackers and woodsmen, capable of moving silently through forests and observing enemy forces without detection. They reported back on Saxon numbers, direction of movement, and the raiders' disposition. The intelligence painted a clear picture. The Saxon force, flushed with success from several days of unopposed raiding, had grown somewhat careless. Burdened with plunder and slaves, they moved more slowly than when they had first crossed the border. More critically, their success had bred overconfidence. They knew Charlemagne was campaigning in Sorb territory, and apparently believed no significant Frankish force could reach them quickly. The Frankish commanders identified their opportunity. The Saxons would need to cross back into their own territory, and the number of suitable crossing points was limited. Rivers served as natural barriers, and the Saxons, laden with loot and captives, would need to use established fords or bridges. By forced marches, the Frankish column could reach one of these crossing points ahead of the Saxon raiders. The Franks pushed their pace to the limit of endurance. Cavalry rode ahead to secure the strategic crossing point, while infantry followed as rapidly as possible. Supply wagons were left behind to maximize speed. The warriors carried rations for several days and foraged as they moved, but the emphasis was entirely on speed and positioning. The battle, preparation, and terrain. The exact location of the battle remains uncertain, though it occurred somewhere near the border between Frankish and Saxon territory, likely along one of the rivers that defined this frontier. What is clear from the outcomes and later accounts is that the Franks chose their ground carefully, transforming terrain into a force multiplier. The Frankish commanders selected a position that controlled the approaches to a river crossing. Hills on either side created a natural funnel, channeling the Saxon force into a relatively narrow front where their numerical advantage would be diminished. Behind the Frankish position, the ford, or bridge, offered a secure line of retreat if necessary, though the Frankish commanders had no intention of withdrawing. The battlefield preparation revealed the sophistication of Frankish military engineering. Working through the night before the battle, Frankish infantry constructed field fortifications. These were not elaborate fortresses, but simple yet effective barriers. Sharpened stakes driven into the ground at angles to impede cavalry charges, shallow trenches to break up enemy formations, and perhaps a palisade of woven branches and earth on the flanks. The Frankish force deployed in a formation that maximized their advantages. The center consisted of heavy infantry, their shields overlapping to create a wall, spears, projecting forward. This solid formation would receive the initial Saxon charge and blunt its momentum. On the flanks, positioned behind the field fortifications and partially concealed by terrain, waited the cavalry units in 2 wings. Behind the main line, a reserve force of both cavalry and infantry stood ready to reinforce weak points or exploit opportunities. This depth to the formation was critical. It allowed the Frankish commanders to respond to developments during the battle rather than committing everything to the initial deployment. The disposition of forces reflected a tactical doctrine that would influence medieval warfare for centuries. The combination of stable infantry and mobile cavalry, the use of terrain and field fortifications, and the maintenance of reserves created a flexible defensive system capable of absorbing attacks and delivering devastating counterstrikes. The Saxon approach: confidence and miscalculation. When the Saxon vanguard first spotted the Frankish force blocking their path, the initial reaction was likely surprise rather than concern. The scouts who raced back to the main Saxon column reported Frankish warriors in defensive positions, but they could not accurately estimate numbers through the fortifications and terrain features. Even when Saxon leaders realized they faced only a few thousand Franks, their numerical superiority seemed overwhelming. The Saxon force faced a choice. They could seek an alternate crossing point, potentially adding days to their journey and risking pursuit by additional Frankish forces, or they could simply crush the small blocking force and proceed home with their plunder. Their confidence in their numbers led them to choose battle. The Saxon commanders deployed their vast force in a traditional Germanic formation. Warriors arranged themselves in a broad line, organizing by tribe and kinship groups. This social organization provided unit cohesion as men fought alongside relatives and neighbors. The bravest warriors and champions positioned themselves in the front ranks, eager to prove their courage and win glory. The Saxon battle plan was straightforward: overwhelm the Frankish position through sheer numbers. They would advance en masse, absorb the initial spear and arrow volleys, and then crash into the Frankish line with superior numbers. Once they broke through the thin Frankish shield wall, their warriors could flood through the breach and destroy the defenders. What the Saxon commanders failed to adequately appreciate was how terrain, fortifications, and Frankish combined arms tactics would negate their numerical advantage. They saw the Frankish center, recognized it as the obvious blocking force, but did not fully account for the cavalry wings or the effect of the channeling terrain. The initial clash: steel and determination. The battle began with the traditional pre-combat rituals. Warriors on both sides beat weapons against shields, shouted war cries, and hurled insults and challenges at their opponents. Saxon champions stepped forward, calling out Frankish warriors to single combat. Some such duels may have occurred, though Frankish discipline likely prevented many warriors from breaking formation. Then the Saxon host advanced. 25,000 warriors moving forward created a sound like distant thunder, a wall of humanity bristling with spears and shields. The ground trembled under their tread. For the Frankish warriors holding the center, this moment tested their courage to the breaking point. Only discipline, training, and faith in their commanders kept them in position. At approximately 50 yards, Frankish archers and crossbowmen loosed their missiles. Arrows and bolts arced into the Saxon formation, finding targets in the densely packed ranks. Men fell, but the advance continued. The Saxons had accepted that they would take casualties approaching the Frankish line. Their numbers allowed them to absorb such losses. At 20 yards, the Frankish infantry prepared to receive the charge. The front rank braced their spears, butts planted against the ground, points aimed at chest height. The second rank held their spears overhead, ready to thrust downward over the shoulders of the front rank. The third rank waited with swords and axes to exploit any breaches or push through when spears broke or became lodged in enemies. The collision was thunderous. The front ranks of the Saxon charge smashed into the Frankish shield wall with tremendous force. Spears pierced bodies, shields splintered, men screamed in pain and fury. The weight of the Saxon charge pushed the Frankish line backward several paces, and for a moment it seemed the defenders might break. But the Frankish infantry held. Their armor absorbed blows that would have killed less protected warriors. Their tight formation prevented the Saxons from penetrating, and critically, the field fortifications and channeling terrain meant that only a fraction of the Saxon force could engage the Frankish line at any moment. Thousands of Saxon warriors stood in the rear ranks, unable to contribute to the fight, while the front ranks grew exhausted from constant combat. The battle in the center devolved into brutal, grinding combat. Men fought and died in the mud created by trampling feet and spilled blood. The Frankish line gave ground grudgingly, sometimes advancing a few paces to fill gaps when fallen Saxons created space. Commanders moved behind the line, pulling exhausted warriors back and pushing fresh troops forward. The decisive cavalry charge. Shock and destruction. As the Saxon force committed more and more warriors to the frontal assault, focused entirely on breaking through the Frankish center, the trap prepared by the Frankish commanders snapped shut. On both flanks, partially concealed by terrain and the dust and confusion of battle, the Frankish cavalry had been waiting for this moment. At the signal from their commanders, the cavalry wings erupted from their positions and charged into the Saxon flanks. The effect was devastating. The Saxons, oriented entirely toward the front, suddenly found armored horsemen crashing into their sides. Warriors who had no room to maneuver, pressed together in dense formations, could not turn to face the new threat. The impact of a cavalry charge in this period was as much psychological as physical. The sight and sound of hundreds of mounted warriors thundering toward you, the ground shaking, lances lowering, created terror in even veteran warriors. When those lances struck, they punched through shields and bodies with terrible force. Horses, trained for combat, trampled fallen warriors and crashed through loosely organized formations. The Frankish cavalry carved through the Saxon flanks, their momentum carrying them deep into the enemy formation. As their lances shattered or became lodged in victims, the cavalrymen drew swords and continued killing. They targeted Saxon leaders, recognizable by better armor or weapons, decapitating the enemy command structure. The Saxon force, so confident moments before, began to fracture. Warriors on the flanks, confronted by armored cavalry and unable to fight effectively in the press of their own comrades, started to fall back. This backward movement rippled through the Saxon formation, creating gaps and confusion. The Frankish cavalry, rather than pursuing deep into the Saxon rear where they might become isolated and overwhelmed, wheeled and charged again, hitting the now disordered Saxon formation from new angles. This required exceptional discipline and training. The natural instinct of cavalry was to pursue fleeing enemies, but the Frankish commanders maintained control, using their mobile force as a hammer that repeatedly struck the Saxon anvil. The collapse. From retreat to rout, the Saxon formation began to disintegrate. What had been a coherent, if unwieldy, attacking force fragmented into increasingly isolated groups. Some units maintained cohesion and tried to conduct fighting withdrawals. Others simply broke and ran, individual survival instinct overcoming collective discipline. The Frankish infantry in the center, which had been on the defensive for what must have seemed like an eternity, recognized the changing tide and went on the offensive. They surged forward, pushing the Saxons back from the defensive line and pursuing them into the killing ground before the fortifications. This was the most dangerous moment for any medieval army. A controlled retreat while maintaining formation was extraordinarily difficult, even for well-trained troops. For an army already fracturing under cavalry attacks, it was nearly impossible. The Saxon retreat became a rout. Frankish cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down fleeing warriors. The channeling terrain that had helped the Franks in defense now worked against the Saxons in retreat. As thousands of warriors tried to flee through the same narrow approaches by which they had attacked, they created massive congestion. Warriors were trampled by their own comrades, crushed in the press of bodies, or simply stopped and surrendered when they found escape impossible. The slaughter was immense. The Franks gave little quarter in the pursuit, driven by years of bitter warfare and the knowledge that showing mercy to Saxon warriors would simply see them raiding again next year. Frankish cavalry and infantry killed methodically, exploiting their advantages while the Saxon force remained disorganized. Some Saxon units managed to break away and reach the river, only to face another crisis. The ford, or bridge, which might have allowed organized units to cross in good order, became a death trap when thousands of panicked warriors converged on it simultaneously. Men drowned trying to swim across in armor. Others were pushed into the water by the press from behind and swept away by the current. The pursuit continued for miles. Frankish cavalry hunted down fleeing Saxons through forests and across fields. Small groups of Saxon warriors who tried to make stands were surrounded and destroyed. The collapse was total, transforming a confident raiding force into scattered survivors fleeing for their lives. The aftermath. Counting the cost. When the killing finally ended, the scale of the Saxon defeat was staggering. Of the approximately 25,000 Saxon warriors who had entered Frankish territory, perhaps only a few thousand survived to return home, and many of those were wounded. Frankish casualties, while significant in the brutal center-line fighting, numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, a remarkably favorable ratio given the initial numerical disparity. The battlefield was a charnel house. Bodies lay so thick in some areas that one could walk across them without touching the ground. The river reportedly ran red with blood for hours, a detail likely exaggerated by chroniclers, but indicative of the scale of death. Frankish warriors methodically stripped the dead of weapons, armor, and valuables, while captives were rounded up for ransom or slavery. For Charlemagne, arriving with the main army shortly after the battle, the victory was both satisfying and strategically significant. The destruction of such a large Saxon force removed one of the main Saxon armies from the field for years to come. The psychological impact was equally important. Saxon tribes that had been considering revolt now thought twice, and Saxon warriors would be more cautious about raiding Frankish territory. However, Charlemagne's response to the victory revealed the darker side of his Saxon policy. In what would become known as the Massacre of Verdun, Charlemagne reportedly ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners. This brutal act, whether motivated by rage at Saxon resistance or calculated to terrorize the Saxon population into submission, would be remembered as one of the most controversial episodes of his reign. Lessons in medieval warfare. Understanding the victory. The destruction of 25,000 Saxon warriors by a Frankish force of 5,000 was not a miracle or simply good fortune. It was the result of specific tactical, strategic, and organizational advantages that the Franks possessed and exploited effectively. Combined arms superiority. The Frankish ability to coordinate infantry and cavalry represented a significant military innovation. While combined arms concepts existed in Roman times, they had largely been lost in Western Europe during the chaos following Rome's fall. Charlemagne's military reforms revived and developed these concepts for medieval conditions. The infantry provided a stable defensive foundation that fixed the enemy in place, while cavalry delivered mobile striking power. Neither arm could have achieved victory alone, but together they created a force multiplier that negated Saxon numerical advantages. Equipment and armor advantages. The qualitative superiority of Frankish armor and weapons played a crucial role. Chainmail, while expensive and time-consuming to produce, offered far better protection than leather or cloth armor. A chainmail-equipped warrior could survive blows that would kill or disable a less protected opponent. This armor advantage meant that in extended close combat, Frankish warriors suffered fewer casualties and maintained combat effectiveness longer. The stirrup, a seemingly simple piece of equipment, transformed cavalry warfare. It allowed Frankish cavalry to deliver shock charges with the full weight of horse and rider behind lance strikes. Saxon infantry, lacking similar cavalry forces, had no effective counter to this mounted shock action. Training and discipline. The Frankish warriors who fought this battle were professionals or semi-professionals who trained regularly for war. Frankish nobles and their retinues practiced cavalry tactics, drilled in formation fighting, and maintained their equipment meticulously. This professionalism showed in their ability to maintain formation under pressure, execute complex battlefield maneuvers like the coordinated flank attacks, and transition from defense to offense at the critical moment. Saxon warriors, while individually brave and skilled, lacked comparable institutional training. They gathered for campaigns, but spent most of their time farming. Their unit cohesion derived from social bonds rather than professional discipline. When the social structure broke under pressure, the military formation collapsed with it. Command and control. The Frankish command structure allowed for centralized planning and decentralized execution. Charlemagne's commanders understood the overall battle plan and had authority to adapt tactics to battlefield conditions. This flexibility allowed them to recognize when the Saxon force was fully committed to the frontal assault and to launch the flank attacks at the optimal moment. Saxon command and control, by contrast, suffered from the confederate nature of their army. Different tribal groups had different leaders, and achieving consensus on tactics during battle was difficult. Once the unified Saxon assault failed to break the Frankish center, there was no effective mechanism for adapting the plan or organizing an effective response to the cavalry attacks. Strategic intelligence. The Frankish ability to intercept the Saxon raiders revealed sophisticated intelligence gathering. The Franks maintained networks of informants in border regions, employed scouts who could track large forces, and used the Roman road system to rapidly transmit information. This allowed them to position their force advantageously, despite being outnumbered. Tactical use of terrain. The Frankish commander's selection of a battlefield that channeled the Saxon force demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. Medieval battles were not random collisions. Successful commanders shaped the battlefield to their advantage. By controlling the approaches to a river crossing and using terrain to limit frontage, the Franks ensured that Saxon numbers could not be brought to bear effectively. The broader impact. Consequences for the Saxon Wars. This decisive victory did not end the Saxon Wars, which would continue for another 2 decades, but it marked a turning point. The Saxon capacity for large-scale military operations was severely damaged. Future Saxon resistance would rely more on guerrilla tactics, small raids, and defensive operations, rather than major offensive campaigns. The battle also demonstrated to other potential adversaries the effectiveness of Frankish military organization. Charlemagne's army was not simply a barbarian horde, but a sophisticated military machine capable of executing complex operations. This reputation would serve Charlemagne well in subsequent campaigns against Lombards, Avars, and others. For the Saxons, the disaster reinforced the lesson that direct military confrontation with Frankish armies in open battle was futile. Future Saxon resistance would focus on exploiting their knowledge of local terrain, avoiding set-piece battles, and trying to make occupation so costly that the Franks would eventually withdraw. This defensive strategy would achieve some successes, prolonging the conflict for years, but it could not ultimately prevent Frankish conquest. The battle also accelerated the militarization of the Frankish-Saxon border. Charlemagne established fortified burghs, fortresses, throughout Saxon territory, garrisoned them with professional soldiers, and created a military infrastructure that made future Saxon revolts more difficult. The combination of military defeat, fortification construction, and eventually forced conversion to Christianity gradually transformed Saxon society and integrated it into Charlemagne's expanding empire. Conclusion: victory through system, not chance. The destruction of 25,000 Saxon warriors by Charlemagne's force of 5,000 stands as a testament to the importance of military organization, training, equipment, and leadership in determining battle outcomes. While numbers matter in warfare, they do not determine results in isolation. The Franks' qualitative advantages, better armor, effective combined arms tactics, superior discipline, and skilled leadership, proved decisive. This battle exemplified the military transformation that Charlemagne implemented throughout his reign. He inherited a Frankish military tradition and refined it into a system that could project power across vast distances, adapt to varied opponents and terrain, and achieve decisive victories even against numerically superior forces. The same military system that destroyed the Saxon raiders would go on to conquer the Lombard kingdom, defeat the Avars, and establish Frankish hegemony over most of Western and Central Europe. For military historians, the battle offers insights into early medieval warfare's evolution. It demonstrates that the period between Rome's fall and the High Middle Ages was not a dark age of military incompetence, but rather an era of innovation and adaptation. The Frankish military system developed under Charlemagne bridged Roman and medieval warfare, combining elements of Roman organization and discipline with Germanic mobility and Germanic feudal social structures. The Saxon warriors who fell in this battle were not inferior soldiers, lacking in courage or skill. They were victims of a military system that was, at that moment in history, more advanced than their own. Their numerical advantage, which might have been decisive in earlier eras or different circumstances, was negated by innovations in tactics, equipment, and organization that the Franks had developed through decades of continuous warfare. This encounter reminds us that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor where skill, training, leadership, and innovation can overcome raw numbers. The 5,000 Frankish warriors who stood against 25,000 Saxon raiders and emerged victorious did so not through supernatural intervention or simple luck, but through the systematic application of military advantages that their society had developed, and their commanders knew how to exploit. Their victory would echo through the centuries, remembered as one of the most dramatic examples of how a smaller force, properly led and equipped, can destroy a much larger enemy through tactical excellence and martial superiority.